She was singing a Taylor Swift song in a homeless shelter, unaware that the Rael Taylor was standing nearby, listening. Volunteering in secret, Taylor recognized something extraordinary in the girl's voice and knew she had to act. But she didn't just reveal who she was. She did something even bigger that would change the girl's life forever. A single recording in a small studio soon took the internet by storm. Now, her voice is reaching thousands, and her story is inspiring millions. How did a homeless teen become a rising star? All thanks to Taylor Swift. Stay with us to find out how this incredible story ends. And don't forget to subscribe. The city hummed with its usual symphony of chaos. Horns blaring, voices weaving in and out of the cold evening air, the occasional burst of laughter swallowed by the wind. The streets of New York had never been quiet, but there was something different about the way sound moved in certain parts of the city. Some corners pulsed with life, neon signs flickering like broken constellations, while others remained heavy with silence, as if the weight of forgotten stories pressed the air into stillness. Beneath the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, a woman pulled her hood lower over her face, tucking stray strands of blonde hair beneath the fabric. She moved with the ease of someone used to walking unnoticed, her shoulders squared against the cold, her hands buried deep in the pockets of an old jacket. She had walked these streets before, but never like this, never with anonymity wrapped around her like armor. Fame had a way of making the world smaller, turning strangers into watchers, but here, in the hush of the city's shadowed edges, she was just another passerby, just another person with a place to be. The shelter sat at the end of the block, its worn brick exterior blending into the rest of the neighborhood. A faded sign above the door bore the name of the organization, its letters softened by years of wind and rain. The door creaked as she stepped inside, the warmth of the room wrapping around her like an old blanket, thick with the scent of coffee and the faintest trace of disinfectant. The air was different here, not heavy with expectation, not sharp with the edges of performance or pretense. Here, people existed in a space carved out of necessity, held together by something far less tangible than walls. She had come to help, to work, to lend her hands in the simplest way possible. No cameras, no flashing lights, no carefully worded statements. Just action, just presence. The shelter's director had offered her a knowing smile when she had shown up that first evening, her name conveniently left unsaid, her identity a quiet understanding between them. She wasn't here as Taylor Swift. She was here as a woman with time to give, and that was enough. The room was filled with the quiet rhythm of routine. Volunteers moved through the space with practiced efficiency, ladling soup into paper bowls, stacking clean blankets on a long table near the far wall. People lined up patiently, some clutching worn jackets close to their bodies, others carrying everything they owned in small, tattered bags. The quiet conversations that wove through the room were not the kind meant for strangers to hear. They were whispered exchanges of survival, of today and tomorrow, of how long it had been since the last real meal. She took her place behind the serving counter, wrapping her fingers around the handle of a ladle, the steam from the soup curling into the air between them. She listened without meaning to, absorbing the stories tucked between the pauses of conversation. A man thanking a volunteer for remembering that he didn't like onions. A woman murmuring to herself as she counted the last of her change, though she would not need it here. A child asking his mother if they would sleep in a real bed tonight. The line moved forward. The bowls emptied and refilled. Time stretched and folded in on itself. The minutes measured not by a ticking clock, but by the gentle rhythm of serving, of hands reaching and receiving. She kept her head down, her work steady. It was easier this way, easier to be part of something rather than the center of it. Then, just as she handed a bowl to a woman wrapped in 3 mismatched scarves, she heard it. A voice, soft but steady, threading through the low hum of conversation. She might not have noticed it if not for the melody, the unmistakable cadence of words she had written in the quiet of another night, in another world entirely. The voice was young, unpolished, but it carried something beneath its surface, an ache, a truth, a desperate kind of beauty that stopped her mid-motion. her hands stilled against the counter. The room did not quiet. The world did not stop, but inside her, something shifted. The girl wasn't performing, wasn't trying to be heard. She was simply singing, as if the music had found her rather than the other way around. The words came soft at first, then grew, filling the space between the clatter of trays and the rustle of fabric. There was something about the way she sang, the way her voice wrapped around the lyrics like they belonged to her, as if they had been waiting for her to give them shape. Taylor turned slightly, her gaze following the sound. The girl sat near the window, her arms wrapped around her knees, her fingers tracing idle patterns against the fabric of her jeans. Her face was half hidden in the dim light, but her voice did not waver. She was lost in the song, in whatever place the music had carried her to. And Taylor knew that place. She had lived in it once, in the quiet space between wanting and knowing, between dreaming and believing. For the first time that night, she let herself be seen, not as a celebrity, not as the woman behind the music, but as someone who understood, someone who knew what it meant to pour yourself into a song, because sometimes it was the only way to make sense of the world. The girl finished the song without realizing she had an audience. Taylor exhaled, the sound barely audible beneath the weight of everything that moment had become. She did not move, did not speak, but in the depths of her chest, something stirred, something that had nothing to do with music charts or sold-out stadiums, and everything to do with a single voice in a room full of forgotten stories. And she knew, in that moment, that she would not let this voice become another story lost to the silence. The next evening, she returned, drawn by something she couldn't quite name. The shelter had the same warmth, the same quiet hum of necessity and resilience. She worked without question, moving through the familiar rhythm of serving, stacking, listening. The girl was there again, sitting in the same corner, her posture folded inward, her gaze distant. There was something about the way she held herself that spoke of someone accustomed to being unseen. Taylor watched, waiting, not wanting to intrude. Then, as if pulled by the same invisible thread, the girl hummed a few notes, her fingers drumming absently against her knee. The melody was familiar, her own, yet no longer hers alone. It had been carried into a different life, reshaped by a voice that had found a new meaning within it. The song had traveled, bending itself into the spaces between struggle and survival, becoming something raw, something real in a way Taylor had never fully known. She moved through the motions of the evening, but her attention kept slipping toward the girl. The ladle in her hand felt heavier, the steam curling into the air blurred at the edges. Music had always had a way of reaching places words never could. It had lifted her when nothing else could, had carried her through nights when silence was too loud. And now, here it was again, not on a stage, not within the controlled echoes of a recording studio, but in a quiet corner of a homeless shelter, in the voice of a girl who had no idea who was listening. She finished her shift without speaking to her, though the thought lingered like an unfinished verse. She walked past the girl as she left, her footsteps slowing for just a moment, just long enough to catch a final note as it disappeared into the hush of the night. The next evening, and the next, and the next, Taylor returned. It became routine, not in the way of obligation, but in the way of something she had unknowingly needed. The shelter was a place where she was not the center, where there was no pressure to be anyone but a pair of steady hands, a quiet presence among many. And each night, the girl was there too, always in the same corner, always curled into herself, always humming, sometimes singing under her breath. Never for anyone, never expecting to be heard. Taylor wanted to understand her, not just the voice, but the person behind it. The way her shoulders tensed when someone moved too close, the way she kept her gaze down, the way she seemed to exist between two worlds, present, but only just. There were moments when the light hit her face in a way that made her look younger, and others when shadows made her look far too old. One evening, as Taylor stacked trays near the back of the room, she overheard a brief exchange. The shelter director, speaking softly, asking the girl if she needed anything. A coat, maybe? A warmer blanket? The girl shook her head, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her sleeves, her answer barely audible. I'm Phoenix. But she wasn't. Taylor recognized that kind of deflection. She had seen it in herself once. The instinct to minimize, to make herself small, to pretend she needed less than she did, to survive in a way that did not burden anyone else. That night, as the girl stood to leave, Taylor moved before she could think better of it. Not a grand gesture, nothing to startle her, just a quiet, deliberate step into her path. The girl stopped short, glancing up, startled, her expression guarded. Taylor hesitated. There were a dozen things she could say, but none of them felt right. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled out a pair of gloves. Nothing special, just something warm, something small enough to offer without weight. She held them out, palm up, an unspoken offer. The girl looked at them for a long moment, then at Taylor, her brow furrowing slightly in confusion, in something unreadable. Then, wordlessly, she reached out and took them. She didn't say thank you. She didn't smile. She only held them in her hands, her fingers brushing over the worn fabric, as if unsure of what to do with kindness when it came without condition. Then she turned, disappearing into the night. Taylor let out a slow breath. She wasn't sure what had just happened, but she knew one thing. She wasn't done. She would keep showing up, and when the girl was ready, she would be there. The winter air settled into the city with an unrelenting grip, threading its cold fingers through the narrow streets and pressing against the windows of the shelter. Inside, the warmth barely held against it. The walls breathed with the steady rhythm of bodies moving, voices murmuring, and the quiet resilience of those who had nowhere else to be. The scent of broth and old fabric wove through the air, the kind of smell that clung to a place where comfort was borrowed but never truly owned. Taylor had lost count of how many nights she had returned. She moved through the space with familiarity now, the weight of routine settling over her in a way she hadn't realized she missed. It was strange how easily she had melted into this world, into the small tasks that kept her hands busy and her mind quiet. Here, no one expected her to be anything more than she was. No one looked at her with the wide-eyed reverence she had come to expect outside these walls. She had blended into the rhythm of the place, and she liked it that way. But the girl, Maya, she had learned, still remained on the edges. She was always there, always tucked into the same corner, always singing when she thought no one was listening. She never asked for anything, never accepted more than the bare minimum of what was offered. Some nights, she'd disappear before Taylor could even register that she had been there at all. Other nights, she lingered, her voice threading through the space like something fragile but unbreakable. Taylor listened. She had always been good at that. The music in Maya's voice was different than anything she had ever known. It wasn't polished, wasn't trained, wasn't molded into something meant for stadiums and charts. It was raw, shaped by a life Taylor could only begin to understand. There was something about it that made her stomach tighten, made something deep in her chest pull tight. It was on one of these nights when the air was particularly sharp and the city beyond the shelter doors felt too big, too indifferent, that Taylor made her decision. She was going to talk to her. Not in the way she had before. Not with small gestures. Not with unspoken offerings of warmth. She was going to break through the quiet wall Maya had built around herself and see what was on the other side. It happened at the end of the night, when most of the shelter's guests had already trickled out into the dark. Maya sat by the window, her fingers tracing something into the frost that had crept along the glass. She wasn't singing, but her lips moved like she was whispering something only she could hear. Taylor took a breath and stepped forward. She expected resistance. She expected the same guarded distance Maya kept between herself and everyone else. But when she sat down beside her, the girl only glanced at her once, then looked away, as if already bracing for whatever came next. Taylor didn't speak right away. She had learned, in all her years of writing, that sometimes silence carried more weight than words. So she just sat, and for the first time, Maya didn't move away. The city stretched out beyond the window, glittering and endless, a stark contrast to the small, worn space they occupied. Cars blurred past, their headlights streaking through the night like ghosts. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed, a reminder that the world outside these walls never stopped moving. Taylor leaned back against the chair, letting the silence settle between them. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she said, "I heard you singing." Maya stiffened, her fingers stilling against the glass. For a moment, Taylor thought she wouldn't answer, that she would slip away like she always did, folding back into the quiet that had kept her safe for so long. But then, so softly it was barely more than breath, she said, "I wasn't trying to be heard." Taylor nodded, though she knew Maya wasn't looking. "That doesn't mean you shouldn't be." Maya let out a slow, uneven breath. Taylor could see the way her hands tightened, how the tension in her shoulders pulled her small frame inward. She knew that feeling too well, the instinct to shrink, to take up as little space as possible. She didn't push. She didn't need to, because after a long stretch of silence, Maya whispered, "I don't sing for anyone." Taylor didn't say anything right away. She let the words settle between them, let them breathe. Then gently she said, "Then who do you sing for?" Maya's fingers curled against the fabric of her sleeves. She turned her face slightly, but her eyes remained fixed on the city outside. "My mom used to say music could make things hurt less," she said after a moment. "That if you sing something enough times, it stops feeling like it belongs to just you." Taylor's throat tightened. She thought of all the songs she had written alone, in hotel rooms that never quite felt like home. She thought of the nights when music had been the only thing that tethered her to herself, when lyrics had become the only way to shape the things she couldn't say aloud. She understood. Maya exhaled, a small sound that might have been a laugh if it weren't so hollow. "But it doesn't work like that," she added. "Not really." Taylor wanted to tell her that it did. That music had saved her more times than she could count, that had stitched her back together when nothing else could. But she knew those words wouldn't mean anything. Not yet. So instead, she said, "I think it's different for everyone." Maya didn't respond, but she didn't move away either. That was something. The moment stretched between them, fragile but unbroken. The city continued on outside, unaware of the quiet shift happening in a small corner of a shelter where two people, from two entirely different worlds, had found themselves sitting side by side. And for the first time, Taylor saw the beginning of something that could not be undone. The city had a way of making people disappear, swallowing them whole beneath neon lights and the hum of restless movement. It could take a person and grind them down, turn them into another shadow, slipping between alleyways, another figure pressed against the cold in doorways where warmth was a distant memory. And yet, in the shelter, time slowed. The walls held something different. An unspoken understanding, a fragile but persistent hope stitched together from second chances and borrowed moments. Maya had started lingering. Not for long, never enough to call attention to herself, but Taylor noticed. She noticed the way Maya would sit by the window a little longer before pulling her hood over her head and slipping into the night. The way she no longer curled in on herself quite as much when people passed by. The way her hands, once constantly clenched, now rested a little easier against her lap. It wasn't much, but it was something. Music still lived in her. That much was clear. It was there in the way she hummed when she thought no one was listening, in the absent rhythm of her fingers drumming against the wooden frame of her chair, in the way her breath hitched ever so slightly when a melody lingered too long in the air. She carried it the way some people carried old wounds, buried deep, pressed close, a thing both precious and painful. Taylor understood that. She knew what it was to hold music inside you, to fear what it might become if you let it slip free. So she didn't push. She showed up, night after night, without expectation, without pressing for more than Maya was willing to give. She worked her shift, ladled soup into bowls, folded blankets, listened to the murmurs of those who had long since stopped expecting the world to listen back. And each night, she kept an ear turned toward Maya, toward the notes that drifted through the shelter like something weightless, untethered. It wasn't until one particularly cold evening, When the wind outside howled through the narrow streets like a wounded thing, that something shifted. Maya had been quiet that night, more so than usual. She sat with her hood pulled low, staring at nothing, her hands tucked beneath the sleeves of her too thin jacket. Taylor had seen that kind of silence before, the kind that settled over a person like a heavy fog, thick with something unsaid. She had been debating whether to say anything when a sound, small, almost imperceptible, broke through the hush of the room. A hum, low and uneven, but unmistakable. Taylor turned her head slightly, careful not to move too quickly, not to shatter whatever fragile moment had just begun. Maya's lips barely moved, her gaze still distant, but the melody grew. Soft at first, then steadier, shaped by something more than instinct. It was one of Taylor's songs, not one of the stadium anthems, not the ones that had carved their way into radio waves and car speakers across the world. No, this was something quieter, something from an album that had never been meant for the masses in the same way. A song she had written late at night, in the kind of solitude that made a person examine the cracks in themselves more closely than they wanted to. Maya sang it like it belonged to her. And maybe it did. Taylor let out a slow breath, the weight of it settling in her chest. She had spent years writing songs in the hope that someone, somewhere, would find pieces of themselves in her words. But it was different hearing it like this, not in a stadium, not in a perfectly tuned performance, but in the voice of a girl who had nothing left to hide behind. A girl who wasn't singing for an audience, just for herself. The song faded as gently as it had begun, the last note barely more than a whisper against the walls. Maya exhaled, her shoulders dropping slightly, as if she had just released something she hadn't realized she'd been holding on to. Taylor didn't speak right away. She didn't want to break the quiet, didn't want to fill the space with words that weren't enough. So instead, she reached for something she had been carrying in her pocket for the last few nights, waiting for the right moment. A small, battered notebook. She slid it onto the table between them without a word. Maya's gaze flickered toward it, wary at first, then curious. She hesitated before reaching out, running her fingers over the worn cover. When she glanced up, there was a question in her eyes, unspoken but clear. Taylor just nodded. For a long moment, Maya did nothing. Then, slowly, she opened the book. The pages were blank. Waiting. Taylor saw the way her fingers tightened around the edges, the way her breath came just a little faster. But she didn't close it. She didn't push it away. She traced the paper lightly, the way one might touch something fragile, something breakable. Then, without looking up, she reached into the pocket of her own jacket and pulled out a pen. And she wrote. Taylor didn't watch. She let her be, let her fill the pages in whatever way she needed to. The room moved around them, conversations rising and falling, the steady clatter of dishes being gathered and washed, the hum of life continuing as it always did. But for the first time, Maya stayed. And that was enough. The days stretched into weeks, the city shifting between bitter cold and brief respites of warmth, as if winter itself couldn't quite decide whether to stay or go. In the shelter, the rhythm remained unchanged. Meals served, blankets folded, quiet conversations exchanged, and voices laced with exhaustion. Faces came and went, some returning night after night, others vanishing into the city's endless maze of streets, swallowed by a world that had no time to notice those who moved along its edges. But one thing was different. Maya was still here. She no longer disappeared the moment the meal ended, no longer shrank into herself whenever someone passed too close. She wasn't entirely at ease. Taylor knew it would take time before the wariness in her eyes fully faded, but she was present in a way she hadn't been before. And more than that, she was writing. At first, it had been tentative. A few words scribbled into the notebook Taylor had given her, pages filled in uneven bursts, as if she wasn't sure whether she had the right to take up space on the paper. But something had shifted since that night by the window. Something had cracked open. Now, she wrote with a quiet urgency, her fingers smudged with ink, the notebook always close at hand, pressed against her chest like something sacred. Taylor never asked to read what she had written. She didn't need to. She could see it in the way Maya held herself, the way her shoulders carried just a little less weight, the way her lips moved soundlessly when she read over her own words. She recognized that feeling, the quiet relief of turning pain into something tangible, something outside of yourself. It was the same feeling she had chased for years, the only thing that had ever made sense when everything else had felt like too much. Music had always been that for her. Maybe it could be that for Maya, too. The thought stayed with her, threading itself into her mind as she moved through her days. It was one thing to write for yourself, to hold the words close like a secret. It was another to shape them into something that could be shared, something that could reach beyond the pages and into the world. But Maya had been singing long before she had been writing, whether she realized it or not. She had been turning herself into music in the quiet corners of the shelter, in the moments when she thought no one was listening. And Taylor had been listening. One evening, after the last meal had been served and the room had begun to empty, she found Maya at the same table, her notebook open, the pages illuminated by the flickering overhead lights. Her pen moved quickly, as if she were trying to keep up with something that might slip away if she wasn't fast enough. Taylor watched for a moment, then sat across from her, resting her arms against the table's rough surface. She waited. Eventually, Maya's pen stilled. She didn't look up right away, but Taylor could see the tension in her hands, the way she hesitated before lifting her gaze. There was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Not trust, not yet, but something close to it. Taylor reached in her bag and pulled out something small, something she had been carrying with her for days, waiting for the right moment. A tiny recorder. She set it on the table between them, watching as Maya's eyes flickered to it, her expression unreadable. "I think," Taylor said softly, her voice careful, measured, "your words deserve to be heard." Maya stared at the recorder, silent. Taylor didn't push. She knew what it was to be afraid of your own voice, to wonder whether it was worth anything beyond the walls you had built around yourself. She had spent years learning that lesson, and even now, even after everything, there were still moments when doubt crept in. But she also knew that fear and creation lived side by side, that the only way through one was to embrace the other. Maya's fingers hovered over the pages of her notebook, her breath shallow, her posture tight. Then, slowly, she reached forward, hesitating only a moment before picking up the recorder. She turned it over in her hands, her thumb running over the buttons, as if trying to decide whether this was something she was ready for. Taylor let the silence stretch. Then, without a word, Maya pressed the button. The red light flickered to life. She didn't sing, not right away. She sat there, the recorder in her palm, staring at the open notebook as if the words on the page might shift beneath her gaze. Then, slowly, she closed her eyes, and she sang. It was soft at first, the kind of sound meant only for herself. But as the melody took shape, something changed. Her voice steady grew. It wasn't polished, wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It was real. It was raw. It was everything music was supposed to be. Taylor sat still, barely breathing, letting the sound wash over her. She had been right. This wasn't just a voice. It was something deeper, something that carried stories far older than the girl who sang them. It was a voice that could reach people if only given the chance. The song faded into the quiet of the shelter, the final note hanging in the air like something sacred. Maya exhaled, her eyes still closed, the tension in her body slowly unraveling. The recorder still blinked red. Taylor reached forward, pressed stop. Neither of them spoke. Maya opened her eyes, and in them, for the first time, Taylor saw something new. Possibility. The city never truly slept, but it changed in the late hours, shedding the weight of the day, settling into something quieter, something softer. The streets still pulsed with movement, distant sirens, the hum of traffic, the occasional burst of laughter spilling from a bar's open door. But there was a slowness now, a breath between the relentless rhythm of survival. Inside the studio, the air felt different. It wasn't like the shelter, where every sound carried the weight of exhaustion and necessity. Here, silence was thick with expectation, not absence. The walls held sound in a way that felt intimate, the equipment a quiet promise of what was to come. This wasn't a stage. It wasn't a crowded space filled with nameless faces and their own restless needs. It was just a room, just a microphone, just the music. Maya stood at the center of it all, her body still in that way Taylor recognized, shoulders tight, hands curled, breath held just a little too long. The headphones sat awkwardly over her ears, her fingers brushing against them like she was trying to decide if they belonged there. She hadn't spoken much since they'd arrived. She had followed Taylor through the doors, past the equipment, into this space that had been prepared just for her. But now, standing in front of the microphone, she looked smaller, as if the weight of this moment had finally settled on her. Taylor watched her from the other side of the glass, her own breath steady, waiting. This was the moment she had known would come, the moment where Maya would have to decide for herself. Taylor had brought her this far, had opened the door, had told her in 100 different ways that her voice deserved to be heard. But she couldn't force the next step. That had to come from Maya. And for a long time, nothing happened. The producer, a quiet man with years of music carved into his skin, adjusted the levels, his eyes flickering between Taylor and the girl who still hadn't moved. He didn't say anything. He knew better than to rush this. Maya swallowed. Her hands trembled at her sides. Her lips parted, then closed. Taylor had seen this before, in others, in herself. The moment before the leap. The moment where fear and creation became the same thing, where a person had to decide whether they were willing to be seen, truly seen, in the way only music allowed. She leaned forward, pressing the button on the console, her voice steady but gentle. No one's listening but us. Maya's head lifted slightly. Her fingers twitched. Her breath shuddered out. And then she sang. At first, it was barely more than a whisper, thin and tentative. But then the melody found her, wound itself around her ribs, pulled her forward. The words, her words, carried something deeper now, shaped not by practice, not by the expectation of an audience, but by the truth of what she had lived. She wasn't just singing. She was telling a story, giving shape to the things she had once only let exist in the spaces between silence. Taylor felt it. She saw it in the way the producer's shoulders lifted slightly, the way his fingers hovered over the controls, reluctant to touch anything, as if the moment itself was too delicate to disturb. She felt it in the way the sound curled through the speakers, raw and unpolished but aching with something real. Maya's voice rose, the hesitation slipping away. She closed her eyes, let the music guide her, let herself be in a way Taylor had never seen before. And just like that, it was happening. By the time the final note faded, the room was different. The air had shifted, heavy with something that couldn't be named but was undeniably there. Maya stood in the silence, her shoulders rising and falling with uneven breath, her hands still trembling but no longer uncertain. Taylor pressed the button again, her own voice softer now. That was real. Maya didn't answer, but she didn't have to, because she had finally stepped into the space that had been waiting for her. The recording became something more than just a song. It became a beginning. It became proof, and the world was about to hear it.